Hey, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we're diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery, smart, sharp, and worth every minute. It was a Tuesday in November, when the trouble walked through our front door. And trouble, as Nero Wolfe would never admit, but I have observed over 11 years, has a way of wearing expensive perfume. Her name was Celia Harwood, and she arrived at 10 minutes past 11 in the morning, which meant I had already delivered Wolfe's mail to the plant rooms, deflected a call from Inspector Kramer about a matter entirely unrelated to anything we were working on, and consumed 2 cups of Fritz's coffee, the second purely for professional reasons. I heard the bell, opened the door, and found a woman of perhaps 40 standing on the stoop with the kind of composure that is either the product of great breeding or great practice. She wore a charcoal wool coat with a fur collar that I recognized as mink, without being entirely certain I approved of my own certainty, and gray gloves that matched nothing so much as the November sky behind her. "Mr. Goodwin," she said. "Not a question." "That's what it says on my birth certificate," I told her, stepping back. "Come in." She came in, removed the gray gloves 1 finger at a time, and looked around the front hall with the careful attention of someone memorizing an exit route. I took her coat and showed her through to the office. Wolfe's office commands a certain kind of respect, whether you intend to give it or not. The walls are lined with books that have all actually been read. The desk is enormous, custom-built, and behind it Nero Wolfe himself occupies a chair that was also custom-built. Because at a shade over 280 pounds, Wolfe has learned that furniture manufacturers do not have him in mind when they design their products. He was reading, when we entered, a botanical monograph with a yellow cover, and he did not look up immediately, which was either deliberate rudeness or genuine absorption. With Wolfe, it is usually both. "Mr. Wolfe," I said, "Mrs. Celia Harwood to see you." He looked up. His eyes, which are small and dark, and considerably sharper than he allows most people to realize, moved over her in a single sweeping inventory. Then he closed the monograph and gestured toward the red leather chair across the desk. "Mrs. Harwood?" He did not stand. He never does for clients, or for anyone, if he can avoid it. "Sit down." She sat with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has occupied a great many formal chairs in a great many important offices. She placed the gray gloves in her lap and looked at Wolfe without the flinch that his appearance sometimes produces in first-time visitors. "I understand you take cases," she said. "Difficult cases." "I take interesting cases," Wolfe said. "Whether they are difficult is usually a matter of how long the client waits before engaging me." A very small smile crossed her face. "Then I may have waited too long." "Tell me." She did. It came out methodically, which I appreciated. I have sat through enough consultations to know that a client who can organize her distress is a client worth having. The disorganized ones spend the first 40 minutes crying about things that turn out to be irrelevant. Her husband was Richard Harwood. "The Richard Harwood," she said, with a tone that assumed recognition. I recognized the name. Wolfe, who pays as much attention to the financial pages as I pay to botanical monographs, likely did not, so I filed it for later. Richard Harwood was the chairman of Harwood and Price Capital Management, a firm that had made an indecent amount of money over the past decade, the kind of firm that gets profiled in glossy magazines and generates the variety of envy that is the engine of most human misery. 3 weeks ago, Richard Harwood had been found dead in the study of their home on East 73rd Street, shot once through the chest with a .38 caliber revolver. The revolver had been found in the room. The police had investigated. The conclusion, official, stamped and filed, was that the murder remained unsolved. "The police believe it was a robbery," Mrs. Harwood said. "A window in the study was broken. Several items were apparently taken." "Apparently," Wolfe repeated. "That is my word, yes. I don't believe it was a robbery." "Evidence or intuition?" "Evidence. The items taken a gold desk set, a small bronze figurine, the silver letter opener, were all visible from the window. Things a thief casing the room from outside might notice. But the safe was untouched. Richard kept $20,000 in cash in that safe. Anyone who knew him would have known about it. Was it concealed? Behind a painting, a Renoir reproduction, which Richard always found amusing. The idea of hiding money behind imitation art. The point is that no professional thief would ignore a safe to take decorative objects, and no stranger would know about the safe. But someone who knew Richard would. Wolfe's fingers, which had been laced across the considerable geography of his middle, separated briefly and relaced. This is, I have learned, is equivalent of leaning forward with interest. The police examined this reasoning. The police examined the broken window and the missing objects and wrote down what they saw. Lieutenant Rowcliffe was particularly thorough in explaining to me why grief distorts a widow's judgment. I made a note. Rowcliffe. This explained a portion of my sympathy for her right there. Rowcliffe is technically a capable police officer, in the sense that a hammer is technically a capable surgical instrument. You have suspects in mind, Wolfe said. It was not a question. I have people in mind, she said carefully. Whether they are suspects is what I am paying you to determine. Wolfe's expression shifted slightly, a fraction of a millimeter elevation in one eyebrow, which meant he had just upgraded his assessment of her from interesting to worth tolerating. Names. 4. Marcus Price, Richard's business partner. They had been in conflict for months over the firm's direction. Diane Elroy, who was Richard's personal attorney, and who I have reason to believe was also something more than that. Owen Hawes, Richard's nephew and the primary heir after myself, who is 26 years old and has the financial discipline of a lottery winner. And finally, a man named Conrad Wick, who had a long and bitter history with Richard that predates the firm by nearly 15 years. Nature of that history? I don't know the full details. Richard never spoke of it willingly. What I know is that Wick appeared at our home approximately 6 weeks before Richard's death, unannounced, uninvited, and that whatever passed between them left Richard shaken in a way I had not seen in 30 years of marriage. The room held a particular quality of silence after she said that, the kind that means something has been said that cannot be taken back, and everyone in the room knows it matters. Wolfe looked at the ceiling for 4 seconds. I counted as I always do, because his ceiling gazing has a rhythm that corresponds to the depth of his interest. 4 seconds is respectable. I have seen him go to 12. Mr. Goodwin, he said, without looking down, what is our current obligation? This is Wolfe's method of asking whether we have money coming in. We did not, particularly. The Benedetti estate matter had concluded the previous month, and what remained in the operating account was sufficient, but not lavish. I said so, in the verbal shorthand we have developed over the years. Very well. He lowered his gaze back to Mrs. Harwood. My fee for a murder investigation is substantial. My retainer is $10,000. If the work extends beyond what that covers, we will discuss further compensation. If I determine your suspicions are unfounded, I will tell you so, and you will still owe the retainer. I understand. I have 2 conditions. First, you will withhold nothing from me. Clients who edit their honesty cost me time which costs them money. Second, you will make the 4 individuals you named available for interview here, in this office, within the next 48 hours. Not at their homes, not at their offices. Here. Mrs. Harwood considered this for a moment. Marcus Price may be resistant. Then he will be resistant while sitting in that chair. Your late husband's business partner has no legal standing to refuse a private interview. Remind him, if necessary, that the alternative is that I conduct my inquiry in ways that involve more people and less privacy. She nodded. She reached into her bag, a charcoal leather bag that matched the gloves, because she was a woman who coordinated even her grief, and produced a check that she placed on the desk. It was already made out for $10,000, which told me she had done this expecting to write it, which told me she was either very confident or very desperate, and that the two states are sometimes the same thing. Wolfe looked at the check, without touching it. Then he looked at her. "One more question, Mrs. Harwood. The invitation." She went very still. "The case was described in the morning's papers," Wolfe said. "Briefly buried. But one detail was not mentioned, which I find suggestive. The study where your husband was found. Was there anything on his desk that evening? Anything that should not have been there?" I looked at Wolfe. He had not read the papers that morning in my presence. He had been in the plant rooms until 11. I had no idea what had prompted this question, which meant either he had information I didn't, or he was fishing with unusual confidence. Celia Harwood's composure, which had been considerable, developed a hairline crack. It ran from her eyes to the corners of her mouth, and lasted perhaps 3 seconds before she reassembled it. "An envelope," she said, "cream-colored, unsealed. There was no letter inside, only a card. The card had 2 words printed on it." She paused. It said, "The Invitation." Wolfe closed his eyes. This means he is either sleeping, which occasionally happens, or thinking at a speed the rest of the room cannot follow. After 6 seconds, he opened them. "Satisfactory," he said. "We will begin tomorrow." After she left, I stood at the window and watched the charcoal coat descend the stoop and disappear into a car that had been waiting at the curb, a dark sedan with a driver, which meant money, which we already knew. Then I turned around. "The invitation," I said. "How did you know about it?" Wolfe had already retrieved his botanical monograph. "I didn't. You guessed." I reasoned. A man with 4 plausible enemies is killed in his own study. The window is broken with theatrical convenience. Objects are taken that are visible but not valuable. These are not the marks of opportunism. They are the marks of arrangement. And men who arrange murders tend to announce themselves, Archie. They cannot help it. The intelligence required to construct a frame is always slightly outweighed by the vanity required to sign it. And the 2 words, "The Invitation," what does that mean to you? At this moment, nothing, which is why it is the most important thing she told us. He opened the monograph. "Call Fritz. I want lunch at 1, and get me everything available on Harwood and Price Capital Management. The firm, the principals, the litigation history, and whatever Marcus Price has been doing for the past 6 months. Don't interrupt me until noon." I didn't. But I thought about those 2 words for the rest of the morning, turning them over the way you turn over a stone, expecting something to be under it. The Invitation. Cream paper. No letter, no signature. Left on a dead man's desk. Whoever put it there wanted it found. That much was certain. What I didn't know yet was whether it was a confession, a warning, or, and this was the thought that sat uneasily with my second cup of Fritz's coffee, a message meant not for the police, but for someone else entirely. The interviews were scheduled for the following day, Thursday, beginning at 2 in the afternoon. Getting all 4 people to the brownstone on West 35th Street within 24 hours required what I prefer to think of as diplomatic persistence, and what the 4 people involved probably thought of as varying degrees of bullying. Marcus Price came willingly enough, which surprised me until I met him and realized that Marcus Price was the kind of man who comes willingly to everything, because he has long ago calculated that appearing cooperative costs less than appearing guilty. He was 61, silver-haired in a way that had clearly been managed rather than arrived at, and he carried the easy authority of a man who has spent decades being the most important person in most rooms. He wore a suit that I estimated at $4,000, and shook my hand with the practiced warmth of a career politician. Owen Haas, Richard Harwood's nephew, required a different approach. He called back 3 times before agreeing, and each time his objection was different. First he had a prior commitment, then he had to consult his own attorney, then he simply wasn't sure he saw the point. I told him, on the third call, that Mr. Wolfe had already been in contact with the executor of the Harwood estate, and that certain questions had arisen about the timeline of the will. This was not entirely true, but it was sufficiently close to the shape of a truth that it served its purpose. He agreed to come at 3:30. Diane Elroy was the easiest. She called us, actually, at 9:15 that morning, before I had even finished the outreach. She had heard from Mrs. Harwood, she said, and she wanted to cooperate fully. And could she bring her own attorney? I said no, because Wolfe's office is not a deposition, and she said she understood, and she would be there at 4. Conrad Wick was the hardest, which was expected. We had an address for him in the Bronx, an apartment on Fordham Road that was a substantial step down from the circles Richard Harwood had moved in, and I drove up there myself that morning, because this was not a conversation to have over the phone. He answered the door in a flannel shirt, and looked at my card with the specific expression of a man who recognizes bad news in unfamiliar packaging. Nero Wolfe, he read. Never heard of him. Most people haven't until they need him, I said, or until someone needs him about them. He studied me. He was somewhere in his early 60s, with the kind of face that has been shaped as much by grievance as by genetics. The lines were there, but they ran in directions that spoke of sustained anger rather than simple age. His hands were large and calloused, in a way that suggested work that had been physical once, and perhaps still was. This about Richard Harwood? This about Richard Harwood. It is. I didn't kill him. Mr. Wolfe hasn't said you did. He wants to talk. People who want to talk usually want something else. Mr. Wick, I said, keeping my voice at the pleasant temperature I use when I want to avoid a door being closed in my face. A woman is spending a significant sum of money to find out who killed her husband. You were seen at that house 6 weeks before he died. You can talk to Mr. Wolfe in a comfortable chair in a private office, or you can eventually talk to Lieutenant Rowcliffe in a room with fluorescent lighting and worse coffee. The choice strikes me as obvious. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door. 5 o'clock, he said. I have work until 4. I gave him the address. He wrote it down on the back of an envelope with a pencil stub, and I noticed that his hand, despite the set of his jaw, was not entirely steady. That afternoon, I sat in my chair by the window of the office and gave Wolfe what I had assembled. He sat with his eyes half closed and his fingers laced, which is his listening posture. Harwood and Price, I said, reading from my notes, founded 17 years ago by Richard Harwood and Marcus Price in roughly equal partnership, though the bylaws gave Harwood a controlling vote in the event of a deadlock. The firm manages approximately $800 million in assets, mostly for institutional clients, with a secondary roster of high-net-worth individuals. Solid reputation for a long time. One SEC inquiry 6 years ago. Nothing came of it. More recently, there are indications of strain. A mid-sized pension fund pulled out 8 months ago. 2 senior analysts left within the same quarter. In the financial press, there are articles, carefully worded, suggesting that the firm's investment philosophy is evolving, which is the polite word for changing in ways not everyone agrees with. The nature of the disagreement? Wolfe asked. Price apparently wants to pursue a more aggressive strategy. Derivatives heavy, higher risk, higher reward. Harwood was traditionalist, the kind of man who thinks a good stock is one you can still hold in 20 years. And the controlling vote? Resided with Harwood. Which means as long as Harwood was alive, Price could not take the firm where he wanted to take it. Wolfe absorbed this. Owen Haas. I flipped a page. 26, as Mrs. Harwood said. His mother was Richard Harwood's sister, who died 4 years ago. By all accounts, Harwood took Owen in informally when he was 18, gave him a job at the firm, a modest salary, a place in his life. Owen lasted 8 months at Harwood and Price, before being let go, for what the people I spoke to described, with some delicacy, as chronic unreliability. He's been living on a quarterly allowance Harwood provided voluntarily, and what he makes doing something in the vicinity of freelance financial consulting, which I understand means he advises people who don't know enough to know that his advice isn't particularly valuable. Significant debts, 2 credit cards at their limits, a personal loan with a private lender at an interest rate I would categorize as aggressive, and what appears to be a substantial gambling obligation that I found traces of but couldn't fully document. The will, according to Mrs. Harwood, and confirmed by public records of the estate filing, the bulk of the estate goes to Celia Harwood. However, Owen Haas is named for a trust of approximately $400,000, payable in full upon Harwood's death, which has now occurred. $400,000, Wolfe said, is enough to resolve chronic unreliability for a time. That was my thought, yes. Diane Elroy, attorney. Her firm is Elroy and Castleman on Park Avenue South, a mid-sized firm with a specialty in estates, trusts, and corporate matters. She has been Richard Harwood's personal attorney for 9 years. She is 44, unmarried, and has by most accounts a formidable professional reputation. The something more that Mrs. Harwood implied, I found no public record of it, but Mrs. Harwood struck me as a woman who does not imply things without reason. We will determine what there is to determine, Wolfe said. Conrad Wick. I turned another page. Though I didn't need to, I had this one memorized because it was the most interesting. Wick and Harwood were in business together roughly 20 years ago. A small investment partnership. Nothing like what Harwood eventually built. That collapsed after 18 months. There was litigation. Wick sued Harwood, alleging that Harwood had misrepresented the partnership's position and effectively frozen him out before a profitable transaction that Wick claimed he had originated. He lost. The court found for Harwood on all counts. Wick subsequently filed a second suit, which was dismissed. He has worked in the 15 years since as a facilities manager, most recently at a warehouse in Hunts Point. A man who has held a grievance for 20 years, Wolfe said, and who showed up at the house 6 weeks before the murder. Yes, he opened his eyes fully. What are your impressions, Archie? You have seen 3 of the 4. This is the part of the job I most value, not because Wolfe depends on my impressions, but because the discipline of forming them clearly is useful. Price is controlled. He's the kind of man who never says anything he hasn't already edited. That kind of control is either innocence or long practice at concealment, and I couldn't tell which from a handshake and a lobby conversation. Owen Haas over the phone sounded scared, but not the scared of a man facing accusation, more like the scared of a man who knows something he wishes he didn't. And Wick, I paused. Wick is angry. He's been angry for a long time, but there's something under the anger that's harder to name. Guilt isn't quite it. It was more like the look of a man standing at the scene of an accident he didn't cause, but maybe didn't try hard enough to prevent. Wolfe considered this for a moment. Satisfactory, he said, and reached for the book on the corner of the desk. I will see them this afternoon. 2 o'clock, 3:30, 4 and 5. Inform Fritz that we will require beer at 2, and that I will not be interrupting for anything short of structural damage to the building. I told Fritz. He took it, as Fritz takes everything, with the equanimity of a man who has learned that the peculiarities of genius are simply the normal condition of the household he has chosen, and that the beer should always be cold. At 1:50, I was at my desk when Wolfe descended from the plant rooms. He spends every morning from 9 to 11, and every afternoon from 4 to 6, up there with his 10,000 orchids, which is either a passion or an excuse. And after 11 years, I am no longer certain there is a difference. He settled into his chair, which accepted him with the sigh of old leather and long familiarity, and he pressed the buzzer for Fritz. Beer, he said, and then Archie, Mr. Price. I went to the door. Outside, the November afternoon had gone gray and specific, the kind of gray that means business. The street was quiet. Somewhere in the city, 4 people were preparing to come and sit in a red leather chair and tell Nero Wolfe some version of the truth. The question, as always, was how thin a version each of them would try to get away with. With Wolfe in the room, the answer was usually not thin enough. Marcus Price arrived at 2 o'clock with the punctuality of a man who considers lateness a form of amateur behavior. He came in without a coat, the sedan that had delivered him presumably carried it, and walked through the hall with the proprietary ease of someone accustomed to offices significantly grander than this one. I showed him to the red chair and introduced him to Wolfe, and they regarded each other with the mutual assessment of men who have spent their lives taking the measure of strangers. "I appreciate you coming," Wolfe said. "My understanding is that Celia has retained you." Price settled his hands on the arms of the chair and left them there, not gripping, just present. "I want to be helpful. Richard was my partner for 17 years. Tell me about the last few months of that partnership." A beat, professionally brief. We had differences of opinion, professional differences. They are not uncommon between partners of long standing. The nature of those differences: investment philosophy, strategy, the direction of the firm going forward. He said this carefully, with the smoothness of a man who has given this answer before, probably to people with more institutional authority than Wolfe. Richard was risk-averse. There are arguments for that approach. I happen to believe the market rewards bolder positioning. He had the controlling vote, Wolfe said. He did. And as long as he lived, you could not take the firm in the direction you preferred. The smoothness acquired a thin underlayer of something that wasn't quite irritation. That's a blunt way to put it. It is the accurate way. Blunt accuracy is my preference. Where were you on the evening of Tuesday, November 4th, between 7 and 10 p.m.? I was at a dinner, the Whitmore Fund Gala. There were 300 people there, including, I imagine, several people who would be delighted to confirm my presence. Were you there for the full evening? A pause, shorter than it should have been, for a man certain of his answer. I left briefly, around 8:30. I had a call I needed to take privately. How long were you absent from the dinner? Perhaps 25. The Harwood residence is what distance from the Whitmore Fund's venue? I don't know exactly. I do, I said pleasantly. 11 minutes by car, at that hour. Price looked at me with the expression of a man recalibrating. I was not at Richard's home that evening. I was outside the venue, on my phone. With whom? Another pause, longer. A private matter. Mr. Price, Wolfe said, with the patient tone he uses when he is in fact deeply impatient, but has decided impatience would cost him information. You are in a room with a private detective, not a court of law. What you tell me is not admissible. What you withhold may cost a widow justice, and may eventually reach ears with more authority than mine. Whom were you speaking with? Marcus Price looked at the bookshelves for a moment. Actually looked at them, as if checking whether they contained anything useful to him. Then he looked back at Wolfe. My accountant, he said. There were some financial matters that needed immediate discussion. At 8:30 on a Tuesday evening. My accountant is thorough. Wolfe moved on. He asked about Diane Elroy. Had she and Harwood had a personal relationship? Price said he didn't involve himself in colleagues' personal lives. He asked about Owen Hawes. Did you know him well? Price said he had met him several times and found him unprepossessing. He asked about Conrad Wick, and this was the one that landed. Wick, Price said. That name. He said it with the specific tone of a man who has heard it once too often. Richard mentioned him, some old unpleasantness. He came to the house 6 weeks before your partner's death. I know, Richard told me. He was unsettled by it. For the first time, something in Price's composure shifted towards something genuine. Richard didn't unsettle easily. But whatever that man said to him, it stayed. Did he tell you what was said? No. He told me it was old business, that it was handled. A pause. He was lying. It was said flatly, without drama, which is how true things often are. Wolfe's fingers pressed together. How do you know he was lying? Because Richard, in 37 years of knowing him professionally and otherwise, had a single consistent tell. When he was lying or concealing something significant, he used the word handled. It meant the opposite. It meant I'm terrified, and I can't talk about it. There was a moment in the room. I wrote it down. Owen Haas arrived at 3:32, 2 minutes late, which from a man who had fought the appointment was practically enthusiasm. He was young in the way that some men remain young too long. There was something unfinished about his face, a quality of features that haven't quite settled into what they're going to be. He was handsome in a vague way, well dressed in the manner of someone spending money they are anxious about, and he sat in the red chair with the posture of a man trying not to look like what he was, which was frightened. Wolfe did not ease him in. Wolfe never eases. You are heir to a $400,000 trust, Wolfe said. I mention this not as an accusation, but as context. Owen blinked. I'm aware of what the will says. Were you aware before your uncle's death? A very long pause. He'd mentioned it, generally. Generally. He said he'd provided for me. Owen's jaw moved. He wanted people to know when he was being generous. Did you know the specific amount? Not exactly. Approximately? He'd mentioned something in that range. Yes. When was this mentioned? A few months ago. Was this dinner notable in any other respect? Did he speak of concerns? Of the man named Conrad Wick? Owen Haas went still, in the specific way that a person goes still when a name is pronounced that they were hoping would not be pronounced. It is a stillness of the muscles around the eyes, primarily, though the hands often participate. I don't know who that is, he said. I wrote, he does. Wolfe looked at him for 4 seconds. Very well. Where were you on the evening of November 4th? At home. My apartment on Amsterdam. Alone? Yes. No alibi whatsoever. Wolfe's tone was not accusatory. It was the same tone he would have used to observe that it was raining. Have you received the trust funds? The estate isn't settled yet. When it is settled, what do you intend to do with the money? Owen's hands on the chair arms pressed down. Pay some debts. Invest the rest. Through Harwood and Price? I hadn't decided. Through Marcus Price, perhaps, in his new direction for the firm? The question landed like a stone in still water, and I watched the ripples. Owen's face went through 3 quick calculations before it steadied. I don't know what Mr. Price's plans are for the firm. But you know Marcus Price. I met him a few times when I worked at the firm. Have you spoken with him recently? In the past 3 months, say? Once, maybe twice. He called to express condolences after Uncle Richard died. He called you, Wolfe said, specifically, to express condolences. Is that strange? It is interesting, Wolfe said, which in his vocabulary means yes. Diane Elroy was composed in a way that was professionally indistinguishable from innocence, and professionally indistinguishable from guilt, which is what makes good lawyers simultaneously useful and infuriating. She was tall, brown-haired, with the kind of direct gaze that takes practice to maintain. She answered questions about her professional relationship with Harwood in the measured, precise language of a woman who draws very clear lines and knows exactly where they are. When did the relationship become personal? Wolfe asked. A pause of exactly the length required to consider whether to deny it. 4 years ago. Mrs. Harwood's suspicion is correct. I don't know what Mrs. Harwood suspects. I can tell you what is true. Tell me. Richard and I were involved for approximately 2 years. It ended 18 months ago, by mutual agreement and with what I believe is genuine mutual respect. I am sorry he is dead. I am sorry in more ways than I would care to specify, and I will not specify them. Did Mrs. Harwood know? I believe she suspected. Did Richard Harwood alter his will to include or exclude you as a result of the relationship or its ending? A flicker behind the direct gaze. I'm not at liberty to discuss the will's provisions, as his attorney. I note that you did not deny being included. I note that you're very good at this, she said, and it was not quite a compliment, and not quite a concession. The envelope on the desk, Wolfe said. The cream-colored envelope with the card reading, "The Invitation." In your capacity as his attorney, did Richard Harwood ever reference anything by that name? An event? A document? An arrangement? Diane Elroy's direct gaze did something I had not expected it to do. It went briefly uncertain. Once, she said slowly. About 2 months ago, he came to my office with an amendment to his will, a minor change to a specific provision. He was agitated. He said something, I thought it was odd at the time. He said, "If anything happens before I can resolve this, tell Celia that the invitation is the beginning, not the end." The room held its breath. Did you ask him what he meant? Wolfe asked. I did. He said it was a private matter and he would explain when it was resolved. She paused. He never came back to explain. Thank you, Wolfe said. You have been more helpful than you perhaps intended. Conrad Wick arrived at 5:03 and smelled of a cold drive and something that wasn't quite resentment, but was in the same neighborhood. He sat in the red chair and filled it differently than the others, not with authority or composure, but with a kind of dense, compact weight, like a man who has been carrying something heavy for so long that the weight has become structural. He looked at Wolfe without speaking first, which immediately distinguished him from the other three. Wolfe looked back. You know why you're here. I know what you think you know, Wick said, which isn't the whole of it. Tell me the whole of it. And then a remarkable thing happened. Conrad Wick, this man of calloused hands and sustained grievance, closed his eyes briefly, opened them, and began to tell the truth. I could tell it was the truth, not because it was pleasant, it wasn't, or because it made him look good, it didn't, but because it came out with the specific texture of something that has been held in place by pressure for a very long time, and is at last being released. 20 years ago, he said, he and Richard Harwood had been partners in something small. He had come to Harwood with an idea, a specific, detailed investment strategy he had developed over 3 years of analysis. And Harwood had expressed enthusiasm, had suggested partnership, had promised equal standing. What happened next he described without excess. Harwood had used Wick's strategy, profited from it substantially, and then dissolved the partnership on legal grounds that Wick could not disprove. Wick had sued and lost because Harwood had better lawyers. I know how it sounds, Wick said. Every man who loses a lawsuit thinks the other man cheated. I thought so. I went on thinking so for 15 years. He paused. Then 6 weeks ago, I got a letter. The room went extremely quiet. A letter, Wolfe said. Cream paper. No signature. It told me that Richard Harwood had kept records from the original partnership. Records that had never been introduced in the lawsuit because, he stopped, because someone had made sure they weren't. Did the letter specify who had suppressed them? Wick nodded slowly. It named someone. It said the records were in Harwood's study, in the safe, in a manila envelope, marked with a single word. What word? Wolfe asked, though I had the impression he already knew. Invitation, Wick said. The silence lasted exactly long enough to establish that this was the center of everything. I went to see Richard, Wick continued. I told him I'd received the letter. I told him I wanted the truth after 20 years. I didn't want money. I wanted... He stopped again. He was scared. The most scared I'd ever seen him. He said he'd sent the letter. Harwood sent the letter. To you. He said he'd been wrong. That he wanted to fix things before something happened. Wick's jaw tightened. Those were his words. Before something happened. Like he knew. Wolfe's fingers pressed together with a pressure that turned his fingertips briefly pale. The safe, he said. Mrs. Harwood told me it was untouched. Were the documents inside? She didn't look carefully enough, Wick said, or no one told her to look for a specific envelope. He reached into the pocket of his flannel shirt and produced with the careful movements of a man handling something fragile, a manila envelope. I went back to the house, 2 days after Richard died. Mrs. Harwood was away. The housekeeper let me in. I told her Richard had asked me to retrieve something, which was true, in a manner of speaking. He put the envelope on the desk. These are what Harwood kept for 20 years, and what someone wanted me to see. Wolfe looked at the envelope without touching it for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "Archie," he said, "call Mrs. Harwood, and inform her that we will need access to the study tomorrow morning. And call Inspector Kramer, not Rowcliffe, and ask him as a personal courtesy whether the cream envelope found on the study desk is still in evidence storage." "And if Kramer wants to know why?" I asked. "Tell him," Wolfe said, "that I believe the murder of Richard Harwood was arranged not in anger, but in response to a secret 20 years old, and that the killer is one of the people who sat in that chair today." He reached for the manila envelope. "The invitation," he said quietly, "was not a threat. It was a trap, set by a dead man for his own murderer." He looked at his hands. Outside, the November dark had fully arrived, and the brownstone held its warmth against it. And somewhere in the city, a killer was sitting with whatever killers sit with the evening after the detective has learned too much. Tomorrow, Wolfe would begin to narrow it down. Tonight, I poured myself a modest rye and thought about what it means to hold a secret for 20 years, and whether the keeping of it is its own kind of slow murder. The following morning, Wolfe spent with the documents from the manila envelope, and I spent on the telephone and in the files. And by the time we reconvened in the office at 11:30, we were both considerably better informed and considerably less comfortable than we had been the previous evening. The documents were, as Wick had characterized them, records from the original Harwood-Wick partnership. Correspondence, primarily, letters and memos in Harwood's handwritten script, some of them with dates that placed them firmly in the period of the disputed transaction. What they showed, read in sequence, was not complicated. Harwood had known about Wick's original analysis before he proposed the partnership, had in fact already begun exploring the strategy independently. The partnership had been offered, not out of fairness, but as insurance, a way to ensure Wick could not pursue independent legal action against what Harwood had already begun to do with Wick's idea. When the strategy succeeded and the partnership became inconvenient, Harwood had found grounds to end it. The documents that would have demonstrated Wick's prior claim had been kept, apparently not out of guilt, but out of what I had decided was something more complicated. The insurance policy of a man who knew he had done wrong and wanted, in some obscure corner of his conscience, to keep the evidence of it close. He kept them for 20 years, I said, and then he sent Wick a letter telling him where they were. Yes, Wolfe said. Why? After 20 years, why? Because something changed. Wolfe was at his desk with the documents arranged before him in the sequence he preferred. Something 6 weeks before his death made Richard Harwood decide that the time for concealment had ended. He sent Wick the letter. He told his attorney that the invitation is the beginning, and he died before he could explain any of it. What changed? That is what we must determine. He leaned back. What did you find this morning? I had found several things. I went through them in order, because with Wolfe, order is courtesy. Item 1. Inspector Kramer, who is at least half reasonable half of the time, had confirmed that the cream envelope was in evidence storage. He had also, when I pressed him, confirmed that no fingerprints other than Richard Harwood's had been found on or in the envelope. This meant either that the person who had left it had worn gloves, or that Harwood himself had placed it there before his death. The second possibility strikes me as more probable, Wolfe said. Why would a man put an empty envelope on his own desk? Because he was expecting someone. Because the envelope was a signal, an indicator to the arriving person that the conversation would concern the thing they both understood by that name. The killer came. The conversation went differently than Harwood intended, and the killer left the envelope behind because taking it would draw attention. Or the killer left it deliberately. Also possible. What else? Item 2. Marcus Price's accountant call on the evening of the murder. I had done some digging. Marcus Price's accountant, was a man named Howard Gell, whose firm was on Fifth Avenue, and who was, by every account I could find, genuinely thorough. He was also the accountant for the Harwood and Price Partnership Funds. A call to him on a Tuesday evening at 8:30 could be about anything, or it could be about the specific financial provisions that would change if Richard Harwood were to die. The bylaws, Wolfe said, in the event of one partner's death, controlling interest reverts to the surviving partner. Wolfe's fingers pressed together. Yes, that is money that could be counted in advance. Item 3, and this was the one that had made me sit with my coffee going cold at the kitchen table. Diane Elroy's firm had filed, 3 days before Richard Harwood's death, a document in the surrogate court, a preliminary filing related to an estate matter. Not Harwood's estate, the estate of a woman named Margaret Wick. Margaret Wick had been Conrad Wick's mother. She had died 14 months ago, and she had left among her modest possessions a package of letters. Letters from Richard Harwood, written 20 years ago. I had not yet determined the content of those letters. What I had determined was that Margaret Wick's estate, and therefore those letters, had been managed by a probate attorney in the Bronx, who had, 4 months ago, died himself. At which point the estate had been referred, for reasons I had not yet untangled, to a larger firm for resolution. To Elroy and Castleman, on Park Avenue South. Wolfe sat absolutely still for 10 seconds after I told him this. Diane Elroy, he said, was Richard Harwood's attorney. She received, through the referral of a deceased probate attorney, a package of letters from a dead woman that implicated her own client in a 20-year-old fraud. That's what it looks like. What would an ethical attorney do in that circumstance? Inform her client, which she presumably did, which would explain why Harwood knew about the letters, why he sent Wick the letter, why he told Elroy that the invitation was the beginning. Wolfe's voice had taken on the particular quality it acquires when the pieces are moving into positions he can see clearly. He was trying to get ahead of it, to settle with Wick before the letters became a legal matter, before they became public. And someone didn't want that settlement to happen, I said. Someone for whom the continued concealment of those letters was worth more than Richard Harwood's life. He looked at me steadily. Now, who among our four had a reason to keep that fraud concealed rather than settled? I thought about it. Wick wanted vindication. The settlement would have given him that. Harwood's death makes the letters legally murkier, not clearer. Elroy had already introduced the letters into the process by accepting the estate referral. Their concealment was already ending. Which leaves Price and Hawes. Wolfe agreed. And between them, I want you to find one thing. He picked up a pen, an unusual gesture, as he doesn't often write things himself. He wrote a name on a slip of paper and passed it to me. Find the connection between this name and either of them. Take whatever time is required, but have an answer by this evening. I looked at the name on the paper. Howard Gell, the accountant. You think Gell is the link? I said. I think Gell knew about the Harwood Wick fraud through his work on the firm's accounts. I think someone paid him to keep it from becoming a legal matter. And I think the person who paid him is the person who, when the letters resurfaced through Margaret Wick's estate, decided that Richard Harwood's attempt at restitution had to be stopped permanently. He set the pen down. Go find the money, Archie. Somewhere a payment was made for silence. Find it. I went to find it. I spent the afternoon doing the kind of work that doesn't look glamorous in the telling, but is the actual mechanism by which most cases get broken. I talked to people who knew things without knowing they knew them, and I followed money through the channels where money goes when it doesn't want to be followed. My first stop was Howard Gell's office on Fifth Avenue, where his associate, a young woman named Peterson, who had the defensive posture of someone managing a difficult professional inheritance, told me that Mr. Gell was not available. I left a card and my most professional smile and went around to his building's back entrance and waited, because I know that the people who are not available to the front door are frequently available to the back one. At around 6:15 when they're heading to their car, Howard Gell came out at 6:20, saw me, and did the specific thing people do when they want to turn around, but realize it's already too late. He was a small man with rimless glasses and the look of someone who has spent his life making numbers tell stories other people wanted told. "Mr. Gell," I said pleasantly. "Archie Goodwin. We're investigating the death of Richard Harwood." "I've cooperated fully with the police," he said, walking. "I'm sure you have," I said, walking alongside him at a pace calibrated to make departure awkward. I had a narrower question. "Harwood and Price has been your clients for how long?" "I don't discuss client matters." "Of course not. I was thinking more about a personal financial arrangement, one that might not have gone through the firm's books." I kept my voice conversational, the way you keep a door from swinging shut, by applying just enough pressure. "Specifically, a payment or series of payments made in connection with some legal documents pertaining to a Bronx estate." He stopped walking. I stopped too. "I don't know what you're referring to," he said. His voice was steady. His face was not particularly. "I think you do. I think someone asked you to facilitate an arrangement, to ensure that certain letters from Margaret Wick's estate didn't reach a particular destination. And I think you were paid for that facilitation. Not by Harwood and Price the firm, by one person." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "I want you to understand that what I did was not illegal. I haven't said it was. I arranged for the referral of Margaret Wick's estate to a specific firm, Elroy and Castleman. There was a finder's fee, standard practice. Who asked you to make that referral to that specific firm?" He put his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the sidewalk and said the name. I wrote it in my notebook. It was not the name I had expected. I needed one more piece before the evening. I drove to a building on Lexington Avenue, where Owen Hawes lived, in an apartment that was too expensive for his income, and found him at home, which young men with no particular schedule usually are at 7 p.m. He opened the door and looked at me with the expression I had learned to recognize in him. Scared, and tired of being scared. "I lied," he said, before I had spoken, "about not knowing Conrad Wick." "I know," I said. "Come sit down and tell me how you know him." He told me. It was not a happy story, but it was a human one. Owen had met Wick 3 months ago, not by accident. He had gone looking for Wick, in fact, after overhearing a conversation between his uncle and Marcus Price. A conversation he had not been meant to hear during a visit to the house on East 73rd Street, when he had arrived early and waited in the hall. The conversation, as Owen recounted it, had included the phrase "those letters from the old woman," and the phrase "Wick can't be allowed to present them," and more damningly, the phrase "handled before it becomes a problem." "But it was Uncle Richard saying it," Owen said. "He said it with the particular pain of someone whose disillusionment arrived later than it should have. I thought it was Richard wanting to suppress Wick's claim. I went to find Wick because I thought, I don't know what I thought, that I could warn him, that maybe I owed him something because of what my uncle had done. But Harwood was trying to help Wick," I said slowly. "I know that now. Wick told me, the evening before Richard died, that Richard had contacted him, that he was trying to make restitution. I thought that meant it was over." He looked at his hands. "And then the next morning Richard was dead." "What Price said during that conversation? Did you tell anyone?" Owen shook his head, then stopped. "I told one person. I told them because they seemed like..." He stopped again. The scared look had solidified into something more like shame. "I told Diane Elroy. She was Richard's attorney. I thought she should know about the conversation." I sat with that for a moment. "When did you tell her?" 3 weeks before Richard died. I thanked him and drove back to West 35th Street, through traffic that I did not particularly notice. because I was thinking about the shape of things, and the shape was becoming clear. At 9:15, I laid it out for Wolfe. What Gell had told me, what Owen had told me, and the sequence as I understood it now. Wolfe listened without expression. When I finished, he sat in silence for a full 2 minutes, which for him is a long time. Then he said, "Get Kramer. It's 9:15. He will not care. Tell him what I tell you, and use exactly these words. The killer knew about the documents before the murder because they were told. The method of their knowing is traceable. I will have a name for you by tomorrow evening, and I will need 1 hour and 1 room." I picked up the phone. Outside, the city turned under its lights, indifferent as always to the specific human disasters occurring within it. But upstairs, the orchids sat in their heated climate, blooming in their useless expensive beauty. And Nero Wolfe sat in his chair and assembled the architecture of a truth from the materials the afternoon had provided. In the morning, he would test it. Wolfe spent Thursday morning in the plant rooms with his orchids, which was either a deliberate affectation designed to communicate that he was not concerned, or a genuine inability to think in the presence of other people. And after 11 years, I have concluded it is both. I spent the morning on the telephone, and the afternoon at my desk, reviewing what I had, which by now was considerable. Let me lay it out, as Wolfe laid it out for me, at 2 o'clock, when he descended and settled into his chair, and asked for beer, and looked at the middle distance with the expression he wears when the pieces have organized themselves. The murder of Richard Harwood, he said, was not a crime of opportunity or passion. It was a crime of calculation, committed by someone who had a specific and quantifiable reason to prevent a specific and quantifiable outcome. He took his first sip of beer. Richard Harwood, 20 years ago, committed a fraud against Conrad Wick. He kept the evidence of this fraud, whether from guilt, from the insurance of a strategist, or from some combination, in his safe for 2 decades. When Margaret Wick's estate surfaced the corroborating letters through his own attorney's office, Harwood made the calculation that concealment was no longer possible. He chose instead to attempt restitution. He contacted Wick. He signaled to his attorney that settlement was coming, and he literally placed, the invitation on his own desk as a symbol that the arrangement of reckoning he had set in motion was now operating. But someone didn't want the reckoning, I said, because the reckoning would have revealed something about someone else besides Harwood. Precisely, and this is the element that had not been fully visible until last evening. He set down the beer glass. The Harwood-Wick fraud at its core was about a falsified document, a record that purported to show that the investment strategy originated with Harwood rather than Wick. That record was in fact authentic. Harwood had created it, but it had been certified, endorsed by a third party as evidence of Harwood's prior claim. Who certified it? Someone who at the time was in a position to lend authority to such a certification. Someone who had access to the partnership's early documentation. Someone who was compensated quietly for that certification, and who has been compensated periodically in the 20 years since to maintain silence about what they certified and why. The accountant Gels certified the record 20 years ago for a fee that began his relationship with Harwood and Price. He has been on what might charitably be described as a private retainer since. Wolfe's fingers touched the desk. When the Wick letters resurfaced, Gell's certification became the most dangerous element of the entire fraud. Because if Harwood settled with Wick, if Wick received legal vindication, the question of who had certified the fraudulent record would surface. Gell could be prosecuted. He could lose his license. He could, in the right legal climate, face criminal charges. So Gell did not kill Richard Harwood, Wolfe said. He is not capable of it, and he had no means of accessing the house. What Gell did was inform the person paying for his silence that the situation had become critical, that Harwood intended to settle, that the letters were in play. And that person killed Harwood. That person arranged for Harwood to be killed, yes. He looked at me steadily. You found the name, Archie. You simply haven't yet accepted what it means. I thought about what Gell had told me in the alley by his building, the name he had given me for the person who had arranged the estate referral to Elroy and Castleman, who had wanted the letters routed to an attorney who would tell Harwood about them, which would force Harwood to act, which would expose Gell's certification, which would give the killer the leverage to ensure that Harwood's attempted restitution died with him. The name Gell had given me was not Marcus Price. It was not Owen Hawes. It was a name I needed Wolfe to confirm, because when the shape of a thing is unexpected, you want someone smarter than you to look at it first. Walk me through it, I said. He did. The motive was layered. Oldest layer was the compensation Gell had been receiving, which had been routed, not through Harwood, who was unaware that anyone other than himself was paying for Gell's silence, but through a secondary channel. A personal account. An account that, if I followed the payment records I had spent the morning assembling, led not to Marcus Price's personal finances, but to an account in the name of a holding company that I had found registered to a woman named Diane Ann Elroy. Diane Elroy had been Richard Harwood's attorney for 9 years. She had also been his lover for 2 of them. She had received, through the referral mechanism that Gell had confirmed, the letters from Margaret Wick's estate. But Gell had not sent those letters to Elroy because of accident or standard practice. He had sent them because Elroy had arranged it. Because Elroy had known about the letters' existence through her own personal relationship with Harwood. He had told her about the original fraud years ago, in the intimacy of their involvement. Because Elroy had been for years the silent guarantor of Gell's compensation, collecting a percentage of what Harwood paid Gell for silence, and keeping it in a holding company. A very comfortable private arrangement. When the letters emerged through the dead Bronx attorney's files, Elroy saw the threat immediately. Not to Harwood, but to herself. Because if Harwood settled with Wick and the certification fraud came to light, the question of who had known about it would lead inevitably to his own attorney. Elroy had tried first to route the letters through herself, hoping to control the narrative. But Harwood, once he knew the letters existed, had moved faster than she anticipated. He had contacted Wick directly. He had told his attorney, her, that the invitation was in motion, not asking permission, but stating a fact. She could not stop him by persuasion. He was a man who had decided to make things right, and men who have decided to make things right are not easily argued with. So she had not tried to argue. She knew the house well, Wolfe said. She knew the alarm codes. She had visited frequently in a professional capacity. She knew the study layout. She knew about the safe. She knew that the broken window and the missing objects, obvious visible objects, would suggest a robbery to a police force already inclined to take the easiest explanation. She staged it, I said. She is a careful and methodical woman. The cream envelope on the desk. She did not take it because she understood that taking it would indicate that someone had known to look for it, which would raise questions. She left it, gambling that it would mean nothing to anyone who found it. She didn't anticipate you. She did not know about me, Wolfe said, until her client retained me, at which point she came willingly to this office, as she told you she would, because a guilty person who controls the information is almost always better served by being present than by being absent. She could manage what I learned, she thought. She was wrong. She was. He picked up his beer glass again, found it empty, and set it down. What remains is the matter of proof. What I have is architecture, a coherent structure of motive and opportunity built from credible materials. What I do not yet have is the connective tissue that will make it stand in a court. The holding company is a start, but Elroy is sophisticated enough to have layered it carefully. He looked at the window, where the afternoon light was going thin. There is one element she could not have sanitized, because she could not have known it existed. The second set of letters, I said. He looked at me with an expression that was, by his standards, warm. The second set of letters. Because here is what I had found that morning, and not yet mentioned. Margaret Wick had been a methodical woman. The letters she had kept from Richard Harwood were one set. But Margaret Wick had been, apparently, the kind of woman who keeps copies of things, particularly things she does not fully trust. and the copy she had kept was not in the package that had gone to the Bronx attorney's files. It was in a tin box, in the care of her daughter-in-law, in New Jersey, who had not known what she had until I called her at 9 that morning and described what I was looking for. Those letters included, tucked among the others, a single typed note on Harwood and Price letterhead. It concerned the certification of a specific partnership document. It was signed by Howard Gell. It was also countersigned as witness to Gell's certification by the junior associate who had been present in the room. The signature read, D.A. Elroy. She had been 28 years old, 3 years out of law school, and she had witnessed a certification she knew was fraudulent. She had known, from the beginning, where the bodies were buried, because she had helped bury them. Wolfe's invitation, and I use the word deliberately because he used it himself and seemed to find some satisfaction in the appropriateness, went out Friday morning. 4 letters, delivered by messenger, requesting that all parties attend a meeting in the office on West 35th Street at 3 o'clock that afternoon. The letters were careful. They specified that new information has come to light that materially affects the investigation, and that the cooperation of all parties at this stage will be noted. They were polite in the way that things are polite when the alternative is considerably less so. I delivered them myself, because for this I wanted to see faces. Marcus Price received his at his office and read it in front of me with the expression of a man accustomed to being summoned to things he'd rather not attend, which is to say, with professional opacity. He said he would be there. Owen Haas received his at his apartment and read it with the face of a man who has been dreading a reckoning long enough that the reckoning's arrival is almost a relief. He nodded and said nothing. Conrad Wick received his at his building in the Bronx and read it with the stillness that had characterized him from the beginning, the stillness of a man who has learned to receive news without showing his response. "The truth is coming out," he said, finally. I did not tell him how much of it. Diane Elroy received hers at her office on Park Avenue South. I gave it to her personally, standing in her corner office with its view of the Midtown skyline and its careful, expensive furnishings and its array of framed degrees and professional citations. She read it without visible change of expression. She set it on her desk. She looked at me. "Will this be the final meeting?" she asked. "I expect so," I said. She nodded once with the composure of a woman who has been managing impossible situations her entire professional life. "I'll be there." I went back to the brownstone and told Wolfe it was set. He was in the kitchen, discussing with Fritz the preparation of that evening's dinner, sole meunière and a watercress salad, with the focused attention he brings to all things he considers genuinely important. He listened to my report without turning from the stove. "Good," he said. "Is Kramer arranged?" "He and Stebbins will be in the front room from 2:30. I asked him to wait until he hears my signal." "Which is?" 3 knocks on the connecting wall. "Satisfactory." He tasted Fritz's sauce and made a small sound of approval. That was the nearest thing to happiness I would see from him that day. "This evening will require precision, Archie. Not drama." "You're telling me not to enjoy myself," I said. "I'm telling you that this woman is very intelligent, and that very intelligent people, when they understand their situation is lost, sometimes decide to make the losing as complicated as possible. Watch her hands." I said I would. At 2:30 I arranged the office. 6 chairs, the red leather one and 5 additional, in the configuration Wolfe prefers for group sessions, which positions him behind the desk where he can see everyone and no one is directly beside anyone else, because proximity breeds whispered conferences, and Wolfe does not tolerate whispered conferences. I put a pad on my desk and 2 sharpened pencils. I set beer on the small table beside Wolfe's chair, and thought briefly about providing something for the guests before deciding that hospitality was not the tone we were striking. At 3 o'clock, they came. Price arrived first, then Wick, who came by car and was precise about it, then Owen, who arrived at 3:02 with the look of a man trying not to run, Then Diane Elroy at 3:05, which was the same slight tardiness she had displayed at the first meeting. Just enough to indicate that she does not allow others to fully set the pace. Wolfe waited until they were all seated. He looked at each of them in sequence. A slow, unhurried inventory. The kind that in a courtroom would be called intimidating, and in his office is simply the way he works. Then he folded his hands. "I asked you here," he said, "to share what this investigation has established, and to give each of you the opportunity to add, correct, or clarify before I present my conclusions to the police." He paused. "I will tell you now that those conclusions are complete, and that the additions, corrections, and clarifications I have just offered you are a courtesy, not a necessity. The case as it stands is sufficient." Price said, "Then why are we here?" "Because I wanted to observe you together," Wolfe said simply. "Now, let me tell you what I know." He told them, with the methodical precision he brings to expositions, beginning with the Harwood Wick fraud, the certification, Margaret Wick's letters, and the holding company that had been paying Howard Gell's silence for 20 years. He laid it out without drama, which made it more powerful. The way a very cold room is more striking than a merely cool one. Price went very still when the holding company was named. Not guiltily still, calculatingly still. The stillness of a man mentally reviewing his own exposure and finding it, with relief, limited. Owen Haas looked at his lap. Conrad Wick watched Diane Elroy. Diane Elroy watched Wolfe, with the expression of someone watching an opposing attorney's closing argument, assessing its strengths and vulnerabilities. She was, I noted, doing exactly what Wolfe had told me very intelligent people do, calculating. "You had known about the Harwood Wick fraud for years," Wolfe said, addressing her directly, "because Harwood told you during your personal relationship. You had been managing Gell's compensation through a holding company, arranging it as a neutral intermediary, a buffer between Harwood's payments and Gell's receipts, taking a finder's percentage for yourself. This arrangement was profitable, discreet, and entirely contingent on the fraud remaining concealed." Elroy said nothing. "When Margaret Wick's estate surfaced the corroborating letters, you saw the threat. You arranged for the letters to reach you, your firm, via the estate referral. You hoped to manage the outcome. But Harwood moved faster than you expected. He contacted Wick directly. He told you himself, in the language you have already confirmed in this room, that the invitation was in motion. That settlement was coming." "That's a theory," Elroy said. Her voice was steady, a creative one. "It is also supported by the second set of letters," Wolfe said, "the copy Margaret Wick made, which includes Howard Gell's certification note and a witness signature. A single beat. Your signature," he said, "at 28 years old, witnessing a certification you understood to be fraudulent, for a man who was then paying you a modest fee as a junior associate's supplemental income. The beginning of a very long and very lucrative relationship." The room was the kind of quiet that has texture. "You entered the house," Wolfe continued, "through the study window, which you broke yourself, from the inside, after entering through the front door with the alarm code you knew. You took the visible objects, because they were visible. You expected the police to file it as robbery, and close the investigation within a month. You did not expect Mrs. Harwood to retain me." "Mr. Wolfe," Elroy said, and her voice was still steady, but it was now the steadiness of controlled effort, rather than natural composure. "You are describing a serious accusation. I am an attorney. I want you to understand that what you are characterizing as evidence is largely circumstantial." "The countersigned document is not circumstantial," Wolfe said. "A 20-year-old document of uncertain provenance, whose provenance will be established by Margaret Wick's daughter-in-law, who has kept it in a tin box in New Jersey and is prepared to testify about its chain of custody." Something behind Diane Elroy's eyes shifted. It was brief, 3 seconds at the most, and it was the shift of a person reassessing the room and finding the exits closed. "I did not kill Richard Harwood," she said. "Not personally." The room moved. "And who?" Price began. Howard Gell, Wolfe said, who was told that if Richard Harwood settled with Conrad Wick, his certification would become the central exhibit in a fraud prosecution. Who was told this by Ms. Elroy, who has been since Wednesday evening cooperating with the district attorney's office. He paused. Gell did not act alone. He hired a man, I have his name, as does Inspector Kramer, who is in the next room, and the money for that hiring came from the holding company, from the account in Ms. Elroy's beneficial control. I stood and knocked 3 times on the connecting wall. The door opened. Kramer came through first, with Stebbins behind him, and Kramer looked at the room with the expression of a man who has lived long enough to know that when Nero Wolfe says the case is sufficient, it is in fact sufficient. Diane Elroy stood. She looked at Wolfe for a long moment, not with hatred, not with fear, but with the expression of someone completing an assessment that has had only one possible conclusion for several minutes. I would like to call my attorney, she said. Of course, Wolfe said. You understand the irony, she said. I do, Wolfe said. It is among the more pointed ironies I have encountered in this work. Kramer took her by the arm, not roughly, and she went without resistance, because Diane Elroy was the kind of woman who understood when a thing was over. Stebbins followed. The room was left with Price, Owen, Wick, and me, and the particular silence of aftermath. After they had gone, Price departing with the brisk efficiency of a man who has calculated that he is clear and wants to leave before anything changes. Owen lingering at the door with the look of someone who has witnessed something significant without fully understanding it. Wick staying until last, standing by the window. It was Wick that Wolfe addressed. You will receive your vindication, Wolfe said. The documentation is sufficient. The estate of Richard Harwood will, I expect, provide restitution as part of its settlement of his obligations. Mrs. Harwood has been informed of the fraud's nature, and does not contest her late husband's moral liability. Wick stood at the window for a long moment. 20 years, he said. 20 years, Wolfe agreed. He could have just, at any point he could have just... Wick stopped. Yes, Wolfe said, which was exactly the right amount. Wick nodded once. He put on his coat, the same flannel jacket he had arrived in the first time, the jacket of a man who does not own many coats, and he walked out of the office, with the specific quality of gait that belongs to people who have just set down a weight they have been carrying so long they had forgotten it wasn't part of them. I closed the door behind him and came back to my desk. Wolfe had his beer and was looking at the ceiling. The holding company, I said. How long will it take the DA to unravel it? Weeks, perhaps months. Elroy was careful, and she is not stupid. But the countersigned document is real, and Gell is cooperating, and cooperating witnesses have a way of accelerating legal processes. She'll get a good lawyer. The best available. It will not be enough. He lowered his gaze. She made one fundamental error, Archie. She knew the fraud. She had known it for years. She had the option at any point in 9 years of representing Harwood to withdraw from the representation on grounds of ethical conflict. Her knowledge of the fraud made her ongoing representation problematic by any professional standard. She did not withdraw because the arrangement was profitable. And when the letters came up, she saw first a threat to the arrangement, and only second a human being who was trying to do a decent thing after a long time of not doing it. Wolfe's expression settled into something that was not quite philosophical and not quite moral, but occupied the territory between them. Richard Harwood was not a good man for most of his professional life. But he was attempting, in his final weeks, to be one. That attempt cost him his life. And the invitation, I said, on the desk. The invitation was addressed to Wick, a private symbol of the conversation Harwood intended to have, the settling of accounts, the clearing of the ledger. He placed it there the evening he died because he was expecting Wick to come that night. Wolfe paused. Wick, as we established, was told by Elroy, through a carefully indirect chain of communication, that Harwood had changed his mind, that the meeting was cancelled. Wick did not go. Harwood waited, and Gell's hired man arrived instead. And the cream envelope stayed on the desk, because Elroy, arriving to confirm the result, saw it and understood its significance, but also understood that taking it would draw attention to the fact that someone had known to take it. He reached for his beer. She underestimated the envelope's significance to anyone who thought about it carefully. She underestimated you. She underestimated it, he said, with a precision I recognized. He does not take compliments easily, and deflects them toward the work, which is the most honest thing about him. The invitation was the beginning. Harwood said so himself. He did not mean it as a warning. He meant it as a statement of intent, that the process of reckoning he was initiating was not the end of the matter, but the beginning of a resolution. He was right, even if he did not live to see it. I wrote up my notes in the subsequent quiet, while Wolfe read his botanical monograph, and Fritz prepared the sole meuniere in the kitchen. The brownstone settled around us, with the familiar sounds of its own continuance, the furnace, the orchid room ventilation from upstairs, the distant traffic of the city, going on its indefatigable way. At 7:30 we ate dinner. Fritz had outdone himself with the soul, and Wolfe ate with the focused appreciation he brings to all things he considers genuinely important. We did not discuss the case. Cases, once concluded, are concluded. Wolfe does not revisit solved problems, preferring to keep his attention pointed forward. This is either admirable discipline or willed compartmentalization, and I have stopped trying to determine which. After dinner, Wolfe retired to the office with a book, and I called Mrs. Harwood. She answered on the second ring. I told her what had happened, using the organized brevity she would appreciate. There was a long silence when I finished. I see, she said. I'm sorry it isn't simpler, I said. Nothing about this was going to be simple, she said. He spent 30 years with me, and he was a complicated man, and the complications extended further than I knew. A pause. Does it get easier, knowing all of it? Some people say no, I said. I find it usually depends on what you do with it. Another pause. Thank you, Mr. Goodwin. Please thank Mr. Wolfe. I said I would. We hung up. I sat for a moment in the front hall, by the door, listening to the city that exists outside the brownstone. The particular nighttime frequency of New York, which never fully sleeps and never fully quiets, which has been the backdrop to every case I have worked on and every solution I have watched Wolfe arrive at, with the methodical inevitability of a man who has simply thought harder and longer and more honestly about a thing than anyone else in the room. The invitation had been the beginning, as Harwood promised. It had begun with a dead man's attempt at decency, passed through greed and violence, and 20 years of buried wrong, and arrived here. At this door, this hallway, this moment after dinner, when the soul was gone, and the case was closed, and a woman in a charcoal coat was somewhere on the east side, sitting with the knowledge that the man she had loved and feared and represented and ultimately outlived had been in his final weeks better than either of them had been for most of their professional lives together. There is not always a clean moral. Wolfe does not deal in clean morals. He deals in facts, arranged in the order they actually occurred, without the comfortable edits that people apply to things they would rather not see clearly. The facts in this case were these. Richard Harwood had done wrong. He had tried too late to make it right. Diane Elroy had built a career on the concealment of that wrong, profited from it, and killed to preserve it. Conrad Wick had waited 20 years for vindication, and was going to receive it from a dead man's estate. Owen Haas had been, at critical moments, more decent than he gave himself credit for. Marcus Price had been, throughout, primarily concerned with Marcus Price, which is not a crime in any jurisdiction I am aware of. And Nero Wolfe, who does not leave his house, who grows orchids, and eats elaborately, and reads books, and refuses to regard the world as anything other than an extremely complex puzzle that has, if you think about it correctly, a solution. Nero Wolfe had once again found the solution. I went back into the office. I sat at my desk. "Wolfe," I said. He looked up. "Next time a woman in gray gloves comes through that door," I said, "I'm raising the retainer." He looked at me for a moment, with the expression that means he is not going to dignify that with a direct response, but would prefer I noted that he has noticed it. "Good night, Archie," he said. "Good night," I said. The orchids somewhere above us bloomed in their climate-controlled oblivion. The city murmured against the windows. The case, filed, finished, closed, settled into the past where all solved things eventually go. And Nero Wolfe turned a page, and I picked up my pencil, and the brownstone on West 35th Street held its warmth against the November cold, which is all a brownstone can do, and which, on most nights, is quite enough.